G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today's episode of Getting Started in the Horus Heresy, we're going to be going over the different factions that are available to you. Now, the reason we're going to do this is because this edition has made a few changes to some of these factions and how they function. So I'll give you a brief overview of the sort of performance we've noted on the tabletop from what we have seen. Some of them we haven't... Well, we just haven't seen them on the tabletop. I was going to say we haven't really seen them, but no, we just haven't seen them. We also have to talk about sort of the background a bit, and who they are, what they symbolise, and of course the ever-present cloud hanging over our head, which is that Marines are all there is in the Horus Heresy, which, as you can see, clearly are not. Anyway, let's get to it. So let's start with the aforementioned Marines. So the Space Marines themselves in the Horus Heresy, obviously there are 18 legions. They are the Dark Angels, the Emperor's Children, the Iron Warriors, the White Scars, the Space Wolves, the Imperial Fists, the Night Lords, the Blood Angels, the Iron Hands, the World Eaters, the Ultramarines, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, the Sons of Horus, the Word Bearers, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Alpha Legion. And I'm very glad I remembered all of that off my head. So, when it comes to different legions, obviously they all have different play styles. There are very strategic legions. That would be someone like, say, Raven Guard, Alpha Legion, Ultramarines. These legions who their troops individually may not be superior to others, although there are, of course, some elite specialist units which are. However, they are able to dominate the battlefield with some really cool rites of war and some interesting tactics and gameplay elements. There are other legions which are much more simple in their approach, and that is that they just kill everything on the table opposite them. That might include, say, World Eaters or Space Wolves or Night Lords. There are legions which are a bit of a blender, especially when it comes to firepower. That might include Iron Warriors, or Imperial Fists, or maybe even the Dark Angels. Of course, Dark Angels also fall into a bit of a balanced category where many of the legions lie. Now, each of these legions has their own Primarch to lead them, of course, but you don't see them on the tabletop too often. There are also other things involved in this game, such as the different special characters, all the different tanks, armoured vehicles, and especially legion-specific units, because each legion has access to their own elite specialist units. So take the Death Guard, for example. You have Mortarian's personal bodyguard, the Death Shroud, these big scythe-wielding Terminators. They are elite, and they are specific to that legion. One of the Alpha Legion's special abilities is they can actually take one of those units from someone else and use it in their own force. So these are the little things to keep in the back of your mind if you want to play the legions. Now, the legion playstyle is very much the baseline playstyle of the Horus Heresy. Because there are 18 legions that are represented, and that represents so much stuff, that is why we get the impression of it being a legion-specific game, and it's all about the Legiones Astartes and yada yada yada. In reality, it doesn't really work like that. You see, it's up to your community what they do and don't want to play. But of course, if you have just one of each legion represented, that's going to be 18 different armies right there. And it's going to look like they're the majority of their player base. It's just the way it works out. But of course, Marines are cool, the background is cool, and the game is cool, so that's why you'll see a lot of them there. So moving on from that, we get to the Mechanicum. Now, Mechanicum has three different flavours. You've got Tagmata, Reducta, and Cybernetica. Now, they've been boiled away a little bit in the new edition, and Mechanicum are kind of a pale shadow of what they once were. Reducta doesn't have anywhere near the firepower they used to because vehicles are generally weaker this edition. Cybernetica is much, much weaker this edition because the things that used to be powerhouses in that force, Domitar, Castellax, Vorax, because of the changes to the weapon skill chart and such, they have really dropped down the power rungs where they would go from getting, say, 3 or 4 kills in a combat phase on the charge last edition to, if they're lucky, they'll get 1. It's a big difference. at the same time as several of their enemies have gotten more resilient. So Mechanicum has suffered a lot during that transition period. It's not that they're unplayable, but the amount of what you would call viable builds has definitely decreased. When I refer to a viable build, I'm not talking about what's going to go to a tournament, if you're that way inclined, and win everything. I'm talking about a force that when you put it down the tabletop, you have a chance of winning. Okay? And it's not some ridiculous 1 in 60,000 chance of winning. Because we don't want to just have every game devolve into, well, I set up my army and I lose the game. Nobody really enjoys that particular aspect of hobby, so let's not go down that route. The Mechanicum in universe, of course, are they're the forces of Mars, which are attached to the Great Crusade, and they're providing all the new ammunition, the backup logistics and such to keep the legions and the Imperial Army going, and they have their own combat militant forces. That is the Tagmata, Reductor, and of course Cybernetica. Cybernetica are focusing on your big monstrous creatures, your Domitar, Castellax, Vorax, Arlatax, Volturax, all that kind of thing. Reductor is things like your Krios tanks, your Karachnos, all your heavy firepower. They are very much the siege specialists of the Mechanicum. And lastly, of course, the Tagmata, which is very much your more balanced overview of the entire spectrum of what is available in the Mechanicum. Next up, we have the Legio Custodes. So these guys are, of course, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, and there's only ever been 10,000 of them. Not that you would know, because I'm pretty sure there are more than 10,000 in the community. So the Custodes are basically an army of elite character level units. They are individually stronger and better than even the lesser Space Marine HQs. The only Space Marine unit which can sort of fight them on a one-on-one would be a Space Marine Praetor, so the highest level of Space Marine HQ, below that of special characters and Primarchs, and even then, some special characters and some Primarchs will struggle against some Custodes units. They are an incredibly strong army. Now, the downside of the Custodes is, one, they have a lot of points that you have to sink into them. That's probably the biggest thing right there. If you want to play Custodes, you're paying 50 odd points per model. Now, of course, for many people, this is a good thing because it means they have to transport fewer models, but it does mean you lack presence on the tabletop, especially when it comes to those missions where you have to do things like hold objectives. Yes, the elite nature of the army and the small numbers makes them very good at those games where it's all about just killing the enemy, but unfortunately for Custodes players, that is not the majority of games. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind if you want to go that route. Now, they have their own Primarch level character in the form of Constantine Valdor. You can argue about whether that's right or wrong, but we're not here to discuss that today. Instead, we just want to point out that at some point in the future, we expect there to be an Emperor model available, and this will be the army that he generally will go with. So there is that. Next up on the list, we have the Sisters of Silence. So the Sisters of Silence were a part of a singular army force with the Custodes once upon a time. Now they're more their own force, which I'm happy with. The Sisters of Silence are the premier anti-psyker / anti-demon units of the Imperium. Downside is, however, because they are non-augmented units, they are not as strong or resilient as Space Marines. As you can see, they're quite a bit physically smaller than a Space Marine, at least in just sheer bulk, even if they do start to rival them in height, perhaps. Because of this, it does mean that when they go up against some of their enemies, they will really struggle, because they don't have the lasting presence, especially in close combat. Demons are one to keep an eye on. If you go up against a big demon, it could cause you a lot of grief. So keep that in the back of your mind if you want to play the Force. Now, what the Force does bring to battle, of course, is the Red October, as well as a bunch of other little things, like you've got psych-out grenades that can be lobbed across the battlefield. You have almost a pseudo Sisters of Battle type force, where you're starting to see things that may become very familiar when you go to 40k. There are units which are equipped with twin bolt pistols, for example. You can see the echoes of what will become Seraphim in them. Of course, it is important to point out here, the Sisters of Silence do not become the Sisters of Battle. They are still two very distinct things. And in 40k times, the Sisters of Silence are the ones who are responsible for overseeing the black ships. The Black Arcs, if you will. Those ships are the ones that transport the Psychers from across the Imperium to plug in as batteries on the Golden Throne. Next up, the Solar Auxilia. Now, the Solar Auxilia are the elite Imperial Army regiments. We're in a funny place in the Horus Heresy right now where we don't have the full Imperial Army. We're still waiting on the PDF for the militia, which we'll get to, and we don't have regular Imperial Army. So the closest we have, and we're probably ever going to get in the game, is the Solar Auxilia. Now, the Solar Auxilia are quite an interesting lot. They have excellent weapons, they have excellent armor. The problem is, in this edition of the game, they really suffer from the way the charts have changed things. So all the things that have changed the game dramatically for, say, how they affect Marines, didn't really change in how they affect the Solar Auxilia. Take, for example, blasts and templates. Blasts and templates across the board are terrible in Marines and Custode 8 level combat. But the Solar Auxilia are still affected as per the previous edition. This means that a weapon that you would consider to be awful or not worth its points ever against Marines or Custodes suddenly becomes worth its weight in gold versus the Solar Auxilia. And of course, as a Solar Auxilia player, you must keep this in the back of your mind, because there are things awarded to you like bonuses for coherency on the tabletop, which just makes you a prime target for something like a Whirlwind Scorpius, or a Vindicator Shell, or a Whirlwind, or a Basilisk, or a Medusa, or any of those sort of things. The only thing working in your favour here is that you're unlikely to see them because they suck so much in every other game mode. The army as a whole, though, being the elite regiments of the Imperial Guard, or the Imperial Army, being in 30k, what they bring is a very elite mindset and playstyle, really. Now, what an elite playstyle constitutes on the tabletop is large blocks of infantry that advance forward 3 inches a turn, firing strength 6 las guns a lot of the time. When they do get into a close combat fight with some of my Marines, it divulges into a pillow fight from the Solar Auxilia, where they just can't land damaging hits on the Marines. Whilst the Marines, on the other hand, are landing just constant punishment onto the Solar Auxilia. So thematic for the lore, but not very satisfying on the tabletop. Then we get to Imperial Militia. Now, Imperial Militia were highly customizable in the last edition of the game. This edition of the game, though, we don't even have the PDF rules for them yet. I believe we were supposed to get them about a month ago, so the fact we still haven't got them is a little bit irritating, but it is what it is. Now, the militia are supposed to represent the sort of make-do forces, the reserve forces, the people who rise up against the Imperium on a planet, or the people who are immediately conscripted on a planet to fight a threat on behalf of the Imperium. It goes both ways. Perhaps the War Master is coming to lay siege to your world, so you just immediately conscript all men under arms. That is something that might happen. Now, the way this played on the tabletop was a very, very weak army that made up for it through sheer amount of numbers, as well as being able to bring an ungodly amount of vehicles. Now, with the nerfs to vehicles and the way that things like weapon skill charts and such have changed, I don't think we're going to see a very thriving militia community this edition. What was very cool about the militia, though, was because they came from a host of different worlds, and because they were highly customizable, you could make militia themed after certain worlds. You could do something that was very akin to, say, plague zombies. For traders is one of the builds that was available. Another one that was available was a tech elite world, something like a Forge World's militia forces, who had access to things like rhinos and land raiders and had higher strength autocannons and things like that. That was something you could do. There was high gravity worlds where you could play a sort of squat-like army where they had higher toughness and better armor across the board. Okay, these were all things that could be done when playing Militia. Will we get that this edition? It's really hard to tell at this stage. Next up, the Demons of the Ruin Storm. So another force which is supposed to have been released in a PDF already, but has not. Demons of the Ruin Storm are not your traditional 40k demons. They are more like the forces of Chaos Undivided, and they embody certain aspects of the different Chaos gods. And to really make them your own on the tabletop, what you would do is you would assign them abilities that were in line with the different Chaos gods, and you would theme and build your army around that. So you could have a Khorne-themed Ruinstorm army, or a Slaanesh-themed Ruinstorm army. They were not Khorne, they were not Slaanesh, but they were basically that. Will we see this again on the tabletop? It's hard to tell at this point, but Demons of the Ruinstorm are a fun army which had a lot of really weird quirks in the previous edition. They are an army that people seem to struggle to play against. I know because people played against my Ruinstorm army, my Project Geiger. Was it no? It was Cronenberg. Project Cronenberg was the name of that army, which was a fun little experiment I did a year ago, which was to build and paint an entire army in less than a month, and yeah, that was fun. Anyway, so for example, the big thing people don't understand is this army is strongest in turn 1 of the game. In turn 1, when they arrive in play, they start out really strong because they've just been summoned from the warp essentially. And as the warp's power starts to recede from the table, they start to lose their stats over the duration of the game, where strength, toughness, attacks all starts to go down, mainly strength and toughness. So that by the end of the game, you can have units that were, say, toughness 5 or 6 at the start of the game, being killed by bolt guns. Just instant killed no matter how many wounds they have. Whether they got 3 wounds, doesn't matter. And it's a really cool mechanic because it forces you to basically throw everything you can in right at the start as a Ruinstorm player. But it also means that a really canny opponent could use that to their advantage and go, okay, I know you're going to be strongest in these turns, so I'm going to maybe limit the amount of forces you're able to fight, or I'm going to cause you to be channeled in a certain direction. Like, I'm going to make you deploy your portals that you enter play from very far away from me. And because of that, it's going to make it very hard for you to get to me in time, and you're going to be so far from those portals you won't get any bonuses. Now, of course, how these portals interact on the tabletop was a big source of contention. I've had my arguments with people over that one, but essentially what it boiled down to was they were very hard to place, and it could even be placed in such a way with just 2 objectives on the table, where it was impossible to put those portals down. It was possible to do such a horrible thing to the Ruinstorm players, and with that in mind, I felt there was some real negatives to it, as well as something like Zone Mortalis, where you could deploy one of those portals and it would just block off a huge chunk of the gaming board. For the worse, because neither player could enter or move through that portal. It was impassable terrain. Will we see that again this edition? Yes, I will almost put money on it. They will pull the same mechanic off. They will just move the goalpost slightly on how it's performed. And last up, Knight Households. So Knights are available. They're a sub-faction in the Liber Mechanicum book, and they can be played sort of as their own thing. There are all different levels of knights, from your little armigers right up to your Pariphons in size. Knights are a lot weaker than in previous editions, and in fact, many knights will lose outright to a Contemptor Dreadnought in close combat. There has just been such a change to how they perform, and especially the way rules are written. Super heavies and such are not in a very great place in this edition, and so I would just recommend avoiding knights except as eye candy. And even if you do include them, or include them as part of Mechanicum Force, they are going to look pretty on the tabletop, but that's really about it. In previous editions, whole knight forces were considered really overpowered to see on the table, a big group of knights, and it could definitely win games with ease, until it ran into that one person who had tooled up for exactly that situation, and then the knights would all be dead in turn 3. Yes, such a thing was possible. Ask me how I know. So that's really it. That's sort of the overview of the different forces available to you in the Horus Heresy. When it comes to what I think a person should pick, I really think you need to look at a couple of factors. One, of course, what you can afford. 2 is what you are drawn towards when it comes to the background, the fluff, and the playstyle. If you're not drawn towards them, then you're not going to enjoy them. Okay? If you love close combat and fighting in close combat and winning your close combats and feeling like you've got the advantage, you wouldn't take something like, I don't know, salamanders, for example, and tooling them up as a close combat army full of chainswords. You can do it, no one's stopping you from doing it, but you're not going to feel like you're the ultimate badass in close combat when you run into that World Eaters, Blood Angels, or Space Wolves army, and they put you down very quickly. Also, you need to look at a third sort of relevant point, and that is paint scheme. Whatever paint scheme you choose can't just look good and feel good on the first test model. It's got to be something that is viable and sustainable long term. And I say this because I've seen so many players, including myself, over the years. I've been playing this hobby since I think 1994, 93, and 93, started 94. So many of us go, I want to do this in the hobby. And we go out and we buy an army and we paint the first 3 or 4 models and go, I really hate painting this army. We've all been there, we've all done it. If the painting of that army is not sustainable, you're never going to complete that project. So why are you starting that project in the first place? You're just creating a dust collector. So don't go down that route. Make sure you like the background, you like the playstyle, and you like the painting. And if you get those 3 things right, then it's the force for you. And I think the forces that are really going to draw the most people this edition will probably be the Astartes, the Custodes, and probably the Mechanicum. That's why they're my top 3 up there. I think the other 4 forces are really going to struggle. There will definitely be people drawn to Demons of the Ruinstorm, like previous edition, but they're going to be that 1 or 2 guys at the event where it's like, oh, that's neat, they bought something completely different. But when it comes to ease of acquiring, definitely Marines, definitely Custodes, both of them. Huge range of plastic kits available now, with a few exceptions of important units, which is another story. But the Mechanicum as well. Mechanicum robots, they look awesome. They've always been super popular. They have beautiful vehicles and sculpts across the range, especially their monstrous creatures. It's just people are going to have to adapt to that new playstyle. Anyway, that's it. Back with the Outer Circle. Hope you all got a little bit of something out of this, and please hit me up with questions and queries in the comments below, and I'll catch you all on the next one.